Welcome to the Joint Pathways and Research and Training Center and Reclaiming Futures November 1st webinar, Promoting Positive Futures, Evidence-Based Practices in Juvenile Justice and Behavioral Health. I'm John Osowski, Director of Dissemination for Pathways, and I'd like to begin with a few housekeeping announcements. Please see the advice on this slide to make the most of your GoToMeeting experience. In particular, please note that during the presentation, all audience members will be muted, but you can send your questions to us via the chat feature. A recording of this webinar will be made available online shortly after this webinar ends and will be available from the link shown below. Next slide, please. We'd also like to invite everyone who registered for this webinar to stay in touch with Pathways RTC by signing up for our monthly RTC updates. We feature links to Pathways resources, like this webinar, as well as news and events of interest to the field. You'll receive an invitation via email after the webinar, and we hope you will accept it. Next slide, please. I'd also like to invite you to stay in touch with Reclaiming Futures. Please sign up for their newsletter using the link you see now, or click the subscribe button in the upper right corner of their website. Next slide, please. This webinar was made possible through funding from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and NIDLR, the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, as well as funding provided by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention and Conrad N. Hilton. Next slide, please. With that, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Promoting Positive Futures, Evidence-Based Practices in Juvenile Justice and Behavioral Health. Next slide. I just would like to ask our panelists today to just say a little hello. We'll be having more formal introductions later, but first I want to introduce Hernan Carvente. He's our young adult representative.
Hi everyone.
Thanks, Hernan. From Pathways, we have Eileen Brennan.
Hello everybody, glad you're here.
And Pauline Giovangi. And from Reclaiming Futures, we have Evan Elkin.
Good morning, everybody.
Krista Myers.
Good morning, good afternoon.
And Bridget Murphy.
Greetings all.
And I'm John Osowski, and I'll be your facilitator today. I'd like to draw your attention to our collaborating organizations today on our next slide. Some information about our collaborating organizations who are bringing this webinar. Pathways Transition Training Partnership, or PTTP, is a Pathways RTC project whose focus is on training service providers. Reclaiming Futures is a national initiative that has created a model for improving juvenile justice. And you'll hear more about these organizations later in this webinar. And now that you know a little bit about us, we would like to know a little bit about you as well. So I'm going to ask that we launch our first poll. This poll will ask about your role in coming to this webinar. So you can click more than one if more than one apply. Are you a juvenile justice provider, a mental health provider, a young person, maybe a peer support provider, a family member or family support provider, or some other role that we're not aware of? Okay. And Amy, if you could let me know if we've got a quorum so far.
We have almost 80% has voted.
That's excellent. That's a great turnout. Let's give everyone about 5 more seconds to just let us know about your role, and then we will share the results. So Amy, if you would please share the results. And we can see that a lot of folks are juvenile justice providers. We have a great number of folks who clicked other as well. So it'll be interesting to know what that other role is. I hope that this is good information for all of us today and that we tailor our comments accordingly. Thanks. You can return to the slideshow now. And the next slide, please. So the objectives of today's webinar include Project PTTP will share information about promoting positive pathways to adulthood training. Reclaiming Futures will describe their work in improving outcomes for juvenile justice-involved youth. And both groups will identify shared principles that guide their work. Next slide, please. To open today's webinar, I would like to introduce Hernan Carvente. He's a very decorated individual that comes to us today. I had a hard time fitting everything on his slide, but a few of the highlights include that he comes to us from the Vera Institute of Justice, where he's a policy analyst. His areas of focus include program development, improving the conditions of confinement, and incorporating youth and family voice in policy reform. Hernan has numerous affiliations and awards, including his service as the National Youth Chair of the Coalition of Juvenile Justice's Emerging Leaders Committee, and being awarded a Next Generation for Change Award by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. He is a graduate of the CUNY John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and he has lived experience in the juvenile justice system. Welcome, Hernan.
Thank you, John. Once again, thank you everyone for this opportunity. Although my role is one of a program analyst, I am going to be speaking more from my own personal capacity and having lived system experience with the justice system. And so, I wanted to share a few key things related to trauma and just the way that young people's interactions with the justice system may, in some way or another, be impacted by the way that they were, experiencing violence in the community, experiencing violence in their homes, or just thinking about the different aspects of trauma and how those things can be exacerbated when they come into contact with the juvenile justice system. As I was growing up, I was a young person who was involved in gangs. I was with a family that was very much suffering from domestic violence, from having a father who engaged in a lot of alcohol, and really witnessing a lot of inter-family violence, not only with my parents, but also with other family members, and just the way that they handled conflict. And these were things that many other young people, as I've come into this work, are similar stories that we hear all around the country, where young people are experiencing these severe issues of violence at home and witnessing, deaths in their communities, or being a part of violence themselves. And oftentimes, those different experiences lead to traumatic experiences that they then carry with them and have no means of support to communicate. And that was really generally my own experience, where I bottled in a lot of these different things that I experienced growing up, and acted out in school, acted out a lot of this in violence in the streets, and really try to figure out ways to cope with some of these things that didn't involve talking about them, or really didn't involve reaching out for help. And I went into the justice system with this, a range of different traumatic experiences and feelings, and never had an opportunity to really speak about them and or deal with them. And the first thing that I experienced while in a facility was this just overwhelming presence of, staff and people who were outside of my immediate family, and people who I had no connection to, and sort of was expected to some degree trust them and talk to them about my different experiences. And so I didn't in the beginning share any of those things, and ultimately I was witness to huge amounts of violence in the system that I was in here in New York, where staff would sort of deal with issues from a young person, including myself, by restraints or using medication. And oftentimes the last means of support was a counselor or someone else. It wasn't the first means of support. And one of the other aspects of this was that I ultimately was told that one of the ways that I could begin to deal with this was through the consumption of some form of medication. In my case, I was offered Seroquel during my time in the system on more than one occasion, because of the just continuously relaying to staff and to the mental health counselors that I had constant anxiety or that I had issues, and they never really understood that being in a space like the juvenile facility was one where hypervigilance is definitely more present because you're constantly worrying about your safety, you're constantly being surrounded by people you don't know, and ultimately there was no, sometimes I just wanted someone to talk to, someone who I could just convey some of these feelings and frustrations, and a lot of that was not something that staff took into consideration. Mind you, not all staff have this training or expertise to be able to deal with these things, and that's one of the issues that definitely became more apparent to me as I continue this work now on the policy end and just working with people to better systems in the community. And so as we're thinking about young people who come into contact with the juvenile justice system, remembering that each and every one of these young people come in with different traumatic experiences, that those traumatic events that they've encountered in their lives essentially become more exacerbated when they go into juvenile justice facilities that are sometimes not adequately staffed to be able to deal with those things. And ultimately that sometimes all a young person needs is someone to talk to, not being provided medication and or not being, thrown to the ground or witnessing more violence because there are just not enough resources in the facility for all the young people there. And in my own personal capacity, I've now begun to realize how many of these different things I've carried with me even into the community, and having never addressed those things while I was out, while I was in the facility. And so as all of you in professionals in juvenile justice and mental health and in other fields, as we now know in the audience, beginning to think about the fact that if you want to work with young people, we have to keep in mind the different types of supports that may essentially not require medication and may require just having specific programs or people from the community who can come in and talk to young people, and really creating relationships between staff and youth that are very pro-social and very much conscientious of the fact that they are in a developmental stage where their emotions and their ability to look forward in life is very minimal compared to that of an adult counterpart. And so I am now in a phase where I can think about these things and reflect upon them. Had you asked me to reflect on some of these things while I was still in the juvenile facility, I wouldn't have known how to share some of these different experiences. And certainly reminding the audience that although I am sharing my lived expertise and my own sort of emotions and feelings that I live through, that these are things that young people are feeling on a day-to-day in each and every one of the facilities across the country. And that if we want to work effectively with them, we need to keep in mind this as we're developing policies and programs that are going to impact young people, especially as it relates to the sort of collaboration and or the cross services that come from mental health and from the juvenile justice systems. And I can also say that because of the experience that I've had in the justice system and from having spoken to young people in Virginia, Indiana, Illinois, and different places where my organization has done work, I constantly see the same issues that I have experienced here in New York in OCFS secure facilities and facilities all across the country. And so to whatever extent we can hold that in mind, that every young person that we're coming across might be dealing with these same things, we can then move towards creating systems that are definitely exchanging the best practices, are really focused on addressing the mental health needs of a young person while in the juvenile justice system, that are in fact more positive than they are punitive, and really thinking about the fact that each one of these young people's traumatic experiences may differ based on the communities that they've come from, based on their family history, and just based on their own ability to having cope with those things when they were in the community. So I thank all of you here for being in this conversation, and if there are any questions for me, I will remain in this webinar towards the end. So thank you, everyone.
Great, and thank you so much, Hernan, for being with us today, and I'm sure that there will be questions for you to answer throughout and at the end when we have our question and answer session. I'd like to turn the webinar over now to Eileen Brennan. Next slide, please.
And actually, I'd like to begin by thanking you, Hernan, for setting out some of the major issues that young people face when they are in the juvenile justice system. You've given us a lot to think about. The Pathways Transition Training Partnership was founded in response to the need for service providers to receive research-based training that builds their capacity to work with young people who are experiencing behavioral difficulties, often as they interact with systems like juvenile justice or child welfare. As part of our efforts, we've launched a free online series of 10 training modules. These modules are based on core competencies which were developed collaboratively with a national advisory group that included young adults and family members, as well as interdisciplinary service providers and researchers. These modules are designed within a social justice framework, and they aim to integrate research-based knowledge and skills, cultural preferences, and principles of youth voice and empowerment. At the end of each module, there's a short quiz, and if it's completed successfully, participants receive a certificate of completion or a continuing education credit. After completing the modules, we found that participants are better able to engage in activities designed to assist young adults with mental health difficulties to meet their personal goals. Today we're going to focus on the 10th module, Evidence-Based Practice. If we could have the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. In this webinar, we're focusing on evidence-based approaches in services for youth. And rather than promoting a specific evidence-based practice, we're emphasizing the idea of thinking in an evidence-based way. So just to define evidence-based practice, it's the selection and implementation of research-supported interventions, a process that involves integrating critical evaluation of available research with service provider knowledge and experience and client values. So I'm sorry, would you go back please one slide? Okay, so there are 5 evidence-based practices that are part of the steps of the process of evidence-based practice. The first one is formulating an answerable question regarding practice needs. Suppose you're working with Sherry, a young person involved in the juvenile justice system after she and a friend were arrested for tagging a store with graffiti. She's been experiencing mental health difficulties and has dropped out of school. So what might you ask? Well, you might ask, how can I engage Sherry in mental health treatment services and help her to move forward toward her goals? That would be your answerable question. The second step is tracking down the best evidence to answer that question. For Sherry, you might find programs that have evidence that young people engage in services long enough to have positive outcomes and successfully connect with educational services. Then you might look at the research evidence of program effectiveness and assess the usefulness of the evidence. So you'd maybe find some successful programs, and then you try to see whether they were effective for young people involved in juvenile justice. And then fourthly, you take your own experience and the values of the young person and their circumstances into account. You might really have an in-depth conversation with Sherry about these programs and ask her which one she thinks she might find appealing, and then which one she thinks might help her reach her goals. And then finally, as you're working with Sherry, you might do evaluation of the outcomes. You might determine whether she stayed in services long enough to support her recovery and reach her goals. Next slide, please. So I would like to tell you that our long lists of evidence-supported treatments for emerging adults, but there actually are lists that include programs that are developed and tested with other age groups. So they've been tested with older adult populations or with child populations. There are some new emerging evidence-based interventions that are giving us a lot of hope, though, that have been tested with transition-aged young people. So I'll mention 4 of them. Transition to Independence is a program which works toward a young person's goals in transition domains, such as education, employment, parenting, and community living. Better Futures has a goal of empowering and supporting young people who have serious mental health challenges and are receiving foster care as they enter post-secondary education. The multi-systemic therapy for emerging adults has been developed to help young people achieve personal growth and goals, and to strengthen key relationships in their lives. And finally, there is a recently developed trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy. And that approach recognizes the trauma experienced by many young people who have been adjudicated and are placed in residential juvenile justice facilities. It helps provide safer environments and helps young people who have been affected by traumatic experiences. So if I can have the next slide, we'll take a look at a general model of positive youth development. These programs that I've just listed and others focused on assisting emerging adults have been developed with a positive youth development focus. Just going back to what Hernan said about trying to have a positive future that people are working toward, that young people see their future in a positive light. So the positive youth development model focuses on actively promoting thriving and well-being across the lifespan. Looking at this model, on the left-hand side, there's some key capacities that Janet Walker and her collaborators in Pathways Research and Training Center have identified. With this kind of a developmental model, there is an increased capacity to be the driver of your own positive development, to engage with people, communities, cultural groups, organizations, and systems that provide opportunities and supportive life contexts. And then young people who are focusing positively are proactive. That is, they seek out opportunities to grow as a person, and finally being able to push ahead despite challenges and maintain fortitude. That means having some strength despite the adversity that they have experienced. On the right-hand side of the models are outcomes. Some increased outcomes, if you have engaged in positive youth development, are skills and knowledge for adult roles, including educational and vocational skills and the ability to promote their own health and mental health. Also, the ability to meet basic needs for housing, health, and safety, and positive connections to community and society, leading to positive personal relationships, work, play, and civic engagement. The arrows in the middle of the diagram are used to make clear that there's a cycling back and forth between the capacities and the outcomes that leads to positive development of the young person and the emergence of their own identity, values, commitments, and feelings of self-efficacy. They're basically in charge of their own life. Pauline Givanji of PTTP will next talk about effective service provider practices which are based on social justice and positive youth development approaches. Next slide, please.
Hello, everyone. This is Pauline Givanji. To work in ways that are consistent with positive youth development principles, providers, regardless of what service system you're working in, must first promote trust on the part of young people by being transparent and reliable, and by following through with your commitments. Do what you say you'll do. As part of developing personal agency, youth need to discover and express their preferences and values. Asking them for their guidance about their preferences and finding out what's working for them can help to individualize and improve services. Therefore, we recommend that you collaborate with youth to develop and implement plans driven by their priorities and perspectives. This requires establishing clear and supportive communication, inviting youth to identify their own priorities for their futures, and working through the conflicts and confusion that they may be experiencing. Providers must also focus on actively promoting thriving and well-being. According to Richard Lerner and his colleagues, a young person is thriving if she or he is involved over time in healthy, positive relationships with his or her community and is on the path to an adult status marked by culturally relevant contributions. This involves acknowledging and building on existing strengths and helping youth to develop skills through practice and learning from successes and failures. Providers also assist positive youth development by supporting and reinforcing engagement in positive experiences and relationships so that youth experience success, and also by helping a young person strengthen connections with supportive family members. Finally, the provider works to enhance the youth's skills and assets, which empower them to take charge of their own future and build confidence, competence, and self-efficacy. Next slide, please. While working with underserved youth from a positive youth development approach, service providers are also committed to promoting social justice. Therefore, there's a need to first engage in person-centered planning by learning about the values and goals of the youth and their desired future. Even if an intervention plan is evidence-based, it will not be effective with a specific youth if he doesn't show up or if he doesn't commit to the program. Therefore, it's vital to address their history and current experiences of trauma, oppression, discrimination, poverty, and other disadvantages that may have contributed to their current difficulties and may affect the capacity to engage in services. And we also need to therefore provide trauma-informed care. This includes providing a place of safety, building trust, offering collaboration and peer support, recognizing cultural and gender issues, and promoting empowerment, voice, and choice. Depending on their personal, economic, and social support resources, participating in formal services may be difficult for many young people, especially if they've experienced trauma in harsh or punitive services. Therefore, it's important to be proactive in using strategies to support youth to engage in services and to remain engaged, such as by meeting youth in their preferred location or providing transportation. Finally, needs are complex, especially for youth who have experienced multiple disadvantages and traumatic oppression, and complex needs can seldom be met by one service sector. Therefore, it's important to collaborate with others at system levels to advocate for improved services for underserved youth and families. Young people come from many cultural groups, and it's important to address cultural issues as described in the next slide. Next slide, please. We acknowledge that many evidence-based practices have not yet been tested for their effectiveness with young people from different cultural groups. Furthermore, there's research that suggests that the low rates of mental health service use by ethnically diverse young people may be due to services not being responsive to their cultural needs. However, culturally focused research studies have provided guidance for offering culturally responsive supports. The following key practices may be helpful. First, a positive cultural or ethnic identity has been demonstrated repeatedly to be a protective factor for youth considered to be at risk. Therefore, it's essential to seek to understand and honor attitudes, values, and behaviors of young people that are grounded in their culture. Many youth who come to our attention are affected by the legacy of historical trauma. We also know that residential segregation, racism, and other forms of discrimination persist in our communities and have profound effects on the well-being of young people. Therefore, we must recognize the impact of discrimination and trauma, support youth to heal from these traumatic experiences, and work to promote more inclusive communities. In working with specific youth, we can explore the importance of their ethnic identity, immigration history, and home language, and provide services that acknowledge and strengthen their connections to their cultural heritage. And we can recognize that culturally diverse young people may have stronger networks of informal support from their families and community, and find ways to incorporate and strengthen this support as we work with them. Next slide, please. When you signed up for this webinar, many of you had specific questions that you'd like covered, such as effective practices with young people of color, ways to involve family members and gain community support, suggestions for bridging service gaps across systems. The 10 modules of our training include this content, and this slide provides a link to a brochure describing the module content and a direct link to the modules. Next slide, please. This webinar is based on the planning we've been doing to prepare for our next edition of Focal Point, which will be focused on justice and recovery and will be published in spring 2017. The next two slides include references related to what Eileen and I have been talking about. Then I'd like to introduce Evan Elkin, Executive Director of Reclaiming Futures, who will introduce the Reclaiming Futures team. Next slide.
And Pauline, thank you so much for your introduction of Focal Point. I just wanted to mention that we do have a couple Focal Point authors on the line with us today, Hernan being one of them, and Evan being another, and Eileen and I are both co-editing this issue. And I also just wanted to address, we've got a number of requests from the audience regarding the slides for this presentation. They will be made available afterward, and we will put that link up again, and I'll send the link in through the chat feature one more time to everybody. So Amy, if we could just move past the references into the Reclaiming Futures section, and I'll turn it over to Evan.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Pauline and Eileen, our colleagues at the Pathways Project. I can go to the next slide. As has been mentioned, I'm Evan Elkin, Executive Director of Reclaiming Futures, and I'm going to be joined in our portion of the webinar today by Krista Myers, who manages our National Fellowship Program, and Bridget Murphy, who is our Program and Policy Analyst for two additional portions of the presentation. Next slide, please. I'll start with giving you a little bit of history and background of Reclaiming Futures just very quickly. We were launched in 2001 with funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And we began with a laboratory of 10 sites that worked with us to develop our model that we now use nationally. We're now in 42 locations in 19 U.S. states. And I'll say that, I'll show you a map in a moment, but when we say site, sometimes we mean an individual county. We have one statewide implementation in the state of North Carolina, and a number of rural counties who've come together to join forces and create a Reclaiming Futures program, a group of rural contiguous counties to share resources, etc. The fact that we were funded by Robert Wood Johnson should be a clue to you all about our focus. Robert Wood Johnson is a health foundation. So we were originally designed as a public health blueprint for juvenile justice, and originally intended to be implemented, and we have been across the full continuum of juvenile justice, from reentry to front-end diversion in courts. But in 2007, OJJDP collaborated with us on something of a multi-year national experiment, looking at the impact of combining the Reclaiming Futures approach with juvenile drug courts, which is a specialized model of therapeutic jurisprudence, now 100 courtrooms across the country. Next slide, please. Here's a snapshot of where we are. You can see that we're, the dark blue states are where we have had implementations. You can see a whole bunch of stars in North Carolina indicating our statewide implementation there. 5 sites in the state of Ohio, and pretty much balanced implementation across the country. Next slide, please. A word or two about what Reclaiming Futures is. We refer to ourselves as a framework or a model rather than a program. And the reason for that is that we're not prescriptive. We're driven by a set of core principles. Many of them you have heard today. For example, counterbalancing the needs of a young person with an understanding of their positive developmental trajectory, the importance of community in crafting an appropriate response for a young person who touches the juvenile justice system. And we allow for flexibility and adaptation in each of the sites and work intensively with each site to develop their own kind of idiosyncratic and effective version of Reclaiming Futures on the ground. A core practice to help juvenile justice jurisdictions in the way that we work has been to engineer an effective continuum of services. And this is really the core of what we mean when we say a public health approach, to begin with validated and universal screening, so we know what the red flags are and what we're actually interested in knowing about a young person who might be at risk and need treatment, to use validated and research-tested assessment tools, to make rational triage decisions, and to focus on what works, to triage young people into evidence-based and specific treatments that match, as Pauline had mentioned earlier. We make our best effort to focus on culturally relevant practices for the young people that we serve. A heavy emphasis on coordination of services. As you know, the juvenile justice system is not one thing. It's a number of agencies that come together in concert to respond to the needs of young people when a young person has has gotten into hot water. So coordination is critical, and that's a big focus of ours. You'll hear a little bit about that later from both of our other presenters. And a point that we like to really focus on, which is in our view, a critical piece of a public health perspective, is that we give equal weight to the non-treatment aspects of a young person's experience. Those things in community and society that promote health, the role of family and community, and the importance of positive youth developmental experiences as receiving equal weight and are counterbalanced with treatment when treatment is necessary. And a focus on the wraparound community experience, which is the rest of your life after you've touched the juvenile justice system. And I'm going to take a pause just to show a very brief video that will give us some grist for our conversation going forward.
Hi, my name is Natalie, and Reclaiming Futures helped me. I went to jail for a little bit and then had to start probation for 6 months, and towards the end of the 6 months there were some complications and I ended up not being able to finish, and I was homeless in Seattle for the whole summer. My plan when I came back from Seattle when I started probation was, as soon as I'm off probation and as soon as they turn 18, I'm going to go back and be homeless again and start traveling across America for a while. And now I'm actually trying to get a scholarship for Edmonds Community College and for photography. And the photography class was really cool because all we really did was we went out and they bought us film and gave us cameras to use, and we go out and take pictures and kind of express ourselves through the photography, and then we just come back and discuss with each other. The classes are usually about a month and a half long. I was actually kind of surprised when they ended. I didn't really want to. They were kind of awesome. Natalie is naturally creative. Like, I think it just flows out of her. Everything that she touches is an art piece. So it was interesting to see the colors in her photographs, to see the lines and diagonals, and you could almost walk like her life with her just in the objects that she photographed. I've actually ran into a lot of people that have seen my stuff. I don't know, it feels pretty good actually. I did something. Reclaiming Futures plays a really special role in the lives of kids who don't think they have that many options. It gives them options, it gives them hope. A lot of the kids talk about hope. They say that the difference between them and other kids is that other kids have hope and they don't. And I think Reclaiming Futures is a program that, through steps and through community support, can offer hope to a whole group of kids who don't even know what that's like.
Okay, we can move on to the next slide. Thank you very much. So, as you can see, for us, this brief vignette is really emblematic of where our heart is as an organization. That the experience of a young person who touches the system should be one that inspires hope and that builds relationship and that kind of offers a new narrative, which is neither a criminalizing narrative or necessarily one that's just about needing treatment or being broken and needing an intervention. Although you saw in the very beginning caption at the beginning of this video that this young person was identified as a person who could benefit from some treatment, and that was certainly part of her experience. But the core of what we do, and in many of our sites around the country, what the young person notices first is the way that they're spoken to and what they're offered in terms of a new narrative that's about them as a young person and emerging adult, and offering them relationship. So I'd like to conclude my portion of the webinar just by touching on some of the many philosophical drivers of our work, and one that we think is really important, which I think those of you who have been around in juvenile justice and juvenile justice reform for the 15 years that Reclaiming Futures has, and that I have professionally, know that this perspective that we have expressed and that our colleagues on the webinar have also expressed was not where we were 15 years ago, and that we were just beginning when we first launched to still kind of dig ourselves out of the super predator narrative about young people, and to remember, I mean, it's great if this is where you're starting your work in the field, and this is the framework that drives your work going forward, but this is not how it was, and to remind ourselves that even thinking about treatment need was relatively new, and I think that Reclaiming Futures, among other organizations, were a catalyst to sensitize the field to the fact that young people had treatment needs, but to remind ourselves that the prevalence of mental health issues and substance use issues is really not a causal link with crime. You hear a lot about, and we were guilty ourselves in our early days in talking about a kind of a circular relationship between drugs and crime, that there really is not a causal link, that really a field that developed initially without any good off-ramps and treatment alternatives really drove kids deeper and deeper into the system without getting their treatment needs met. And that's really what we've been seeing over time. Another point we'd like to make is that doing public health and juvenile justice is a really tricky thing, and I think we've all kind of we've re-engineered juvenile justice in many ways to be focused a lot on trauma and a lot on treatment, but the concurrent goals are really often at odds with themselves. The goal of holding young people accountable for misbehavior, controlling young people. Hernan's comments earlier on really point out the lens that is used to look at treatment and at behavior by the two real, kind of conflicting domains in the field right now can often distort. Like, Hernan, you described the use of medication to control and subdue somebody, and I think you hear a lot of decision-making in court about level of care. Should we put someone in a residential, make a residential referral? Because the monitoring function and the confining function of a residential placement is appealing when your focus is mainly on accountability and not on health and wellness. So we're very mindful at Reclaiming Futures that it's important to help decision makers tease those things apart when they make decisions. And our view, as we've said in a number of different ways, that the resolution of this conflict is to empower the community, including the treatment community, to take a stronger voice in this conversation and to put ourselves out of a job. Those of us, in juvenile justice, who say that if we succeed in doing what we're really trying to do with juvenile justice reform, we'll put ourselves out of a job, and we believe that's really true. I'd like to also reinforce the point that Pauline made, which is really a true public health perspective, is one that not only sees racial and ethnic disparities as a risk to health, to population health, but is willing to engage in an explicit conversation with young people about how their experience of being of another race, of another culture, has impacted their pathway to adulthood and to health, and that this is a topic of conversation in treatment. We know that in juvenile justice we've made great gains. We detain and incarcerate far fewer people, young people, than we ever have, but none of the reforms have really affected outcomes for young people of color. And at Reclaiming Futures, we seek to be intentional about tackling that challenge. And to finally reinforce the point that is really the theme of this webinar, which is that evidence-based practices and the decision-making tools that are now available to us in juvenile justice to determine treatment need, et cetera, really have been the beacon that have led us out of kind of the dark ages of juvenile justice. And that although we have great respect for decision makers, I think the tools and evidence-based practices have been critical to the reform narrative in juvenile justice. I will now turn the microphone over to Krista Myers, our fellowship manager, and ask you to flip to the next slide.
Thank you, Evan. I'm now going to talk a bit about how we work on the ground. To reintroduce myself, I am the Fellowship Program Manager at our National Program Office. Prior to moving to Portland, Oregon, I worked in the field as the project director at the Reclaiming Futures site in Hocking County, Ohio. Building strong cross-disciplinary leadership teams is one of the key elements in the successful implementation of the Reclaiming Futures model and in promoting broad buy-in to our principles at the local level. The teams are comprised of a leader from each of the major stakeholder groups in juvenile justice. We call each member of the team a fellow. So at each site, we have a judicial fellow. This can be a juvenile judge who oversees a specialized treatment court docket or a delinquency caseload, a juvenile justice fellow, oftentimes a chief probation officer, a community fellow, perhaps the director of a local mentoring agency or staff from the Parks and Rec Department, or as you saw in the video, an art instructor, a treatment fellow. Usually this person is a clinical director with a local treatment provider or an administrator from the treatment funding agency, and a project director who can be from a variety of agencies across disciplines. Some sites involve additional community stakeholders as part of their initiatives. Cross-system collaboration is critical when working in any multi-system effort. However, it does not happen unless you are intentional about it. Conversations on shared expectations are crucial between judges and treatment providers, as are discussions with community members. These dialogues are important, but don't always occur without a team plan. Some ways the National Program Office supports our fellows are by encouraging site teams to create strategic implementation plans and encourage regular convening of team meetings. We have developed monographs or guiding documents for each fellowship and encourage the use of fellowship agreement forms, which are something like contracts or MOUs and which describe the respective roles and responsibilities. We also provide a significant amount of resources and support that fellows can access through a password-protected section of our website. Next slide, please. Another important part of our implementation strategy is the National Learning Collaborative. Each of our fellowships is led by a national expert in their field, and along with the National Program Office, help moderate ongoing discussions, training, and peer-to-peer sharing within the Learning Collaborative. We gather our fellowships together in a couple of ways. With in-person meetings, for example, we have an upcoming meeting with our project directors and judicial fellows in Austin, and online through fellowship webinar calls and office hour webinars, where we explore specific parts of the Reclaiming Futures model or implementation strategies. We plan fellowship webinar calls with individual fellowships and cross-fellowships. For example, a call with juvenile justice and community fellows, or with treatment and judicial fellows. Both types, individual and cross-fellowship, are critical to shared learning. The positive feedback we hear from local teams about the chance to discuss ideas with other professionals doing this work around the country and to learn about their successes and challenges helps support the need for our National Learning Collaborative work. Next slide, please. I would like to take the opportunity to introduce my colleague, Bridget Murphy.
Thank you, Krista. We do have a question about the fellowship team. Is it describe the team for the whole project or the team for an individual use? So before I go, maybe you want to just address that question?
Yes, it is the team for the whole project.
Thank you. So thank you again, Krista. As the program and policy analyst, I'm going to spend a short time providing an overview of the Reclaiming Futures evaluation. Unfortunately, I will be unable to provide too much depth regarding the methods and the results, but I have included a reference list with links to the reports and publications. I encourage you to take a look at these as they provide important information regarding the strengths and limitations to these evaluations. To start, Dr. Jeffrey Butts from John Jay College of Criminal Justice has been involved in the evaluation of Reclaiming Futures since it started. Butts and colleagues conducted the evaluation for the first 10 sites funded by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. This year, a new report was produced. It offers a history on Reclaiming Futures, discusses the policy context for implementation, provides a list of evidence-based principles and practices for treating youth with substance use disorders, and offers an overview of the multiple evaluation conducted over the years. As part of this report, Butts and colleagues also conducted a new evaluation. They surveyed key stakeholders from 9 sites that were involved with Reclaiming Futures in 2003, 2006, and 2015. The survey examined issues of system change. In combination with the survey, the research team interviewed personnel from Reclaiming Futures National Office to ask them to rate each site's level of engagement with the national initiative. Engagement dimensions were defined as communication, consistency, support, funding, etc. What they found was that those sites that remained strongly engaged over time had significantly better perceptions about the local systems in the areas of access to services and resource management. So why is this important? As Krista mentioned, part of our ongoing training and technical assistant efforts, the National Office provides opportunities for Reclaiming Futures sites to remain engaged regardless of their funding status. While these results are preliminary, they show that remaining engaged with Reclaiming Futures translates into positive perceptions of local systems. This is one of our primary goals. Through our Learning Collaborative, we attempt to improve systems in order to improve the health and wellness of youth and families, and as Hernan said, encourage youth to look forward and keep hope. Said another way, by providing ongoing learning opportunities for juvenile justice and behavioral health professionals, we can improve the perceptions of local systems. Next slide, please. Results from another evaluation have also been recently released. In 2011, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, also known as OJJDP, through an interagency agreement with the Library of Congress, funded the National Cross-Site Evaluation of Juvenile Drug Courts, which I will now refer to as JDCs, and Reclaiming Futures, which I will refer to as RF. The study was led by the University of Arizona Southwest Institute for Research on Women, also known as CIRO, in collaboration with Chestnut Health Systems and Carnevale Associates LLC, and a health economist from the University of Miami. The study had multiple goals and objectives with an overarching goal to examine if and how the blended approach of JDCs and RF compared to standalone JDCs and intensive outpatient programs. The researchers conducted implementation, process, outcome, and cost evaluation. Numerous reports and publications have been developed and disseminated as a result of this study, and more are planned. Many of these can be found on the CIRO website. Next slide, please. I'm unable to go through all the results from these evaluations, but here are some key highlights. Before I get started, I want to mention that these results include data from 5 JDC RF sites. Another cohort of sites were included in the evaluation, and those results are forthcoming. In describing the youth in the blended JDC RF approach, Baumer and colleagues found that JDC RF youth were younger, male, non-white, and had higher rates of depression in comparison to the general population of youth who met criteria for JDCs. In the article, the researchers articulate these results and note that JDC RF sites set out to actively recruit youth with co-occurring issues. This is relevant as the literature shows treating both substance use and mental health disorders is effective for youth. The results also show reductions in substance use and delinquency and crime over time among youth. The researchers used repeated measured analysis to examine changes over time from baseline to 3, 6, and 12 months post-baseline. The researchers also wanted to know if there were certain program characteristics that had bigger impact on outcome variables such as substance use, crime, and delinquency. Both JDCs and Reclaiming Future sites use best practices to address substance use among youth. Understanding the program characteristics that are most effective is critical for program planning, resource allocation, and young people's health and wellness. These 7 program characteristics resulted in positive changes in substance use and delinquency and crime among youth. The investigators called for program planners to consider these 7 characteristics as critical program components for implementation. One primary element of Reclaiming Futures is the importance of engaging with the community. We take the premise that keeping youth from further involvement in the juvenile justice system, we must collaborate and activate the community. This is not necessarily an easy task. However, Green and colleagues use qualitative methods to identify challenges and offer 8 practical recommendations for engaging with the community. These include making community discussions part of meeting agendas and allocating staff time to community collaboration efforts. Finally, McCollister and colleagues conducted a cost analysis on JDC-RF. The researchers used standard economic indicators for costs associated with days of missed school or work, days of physical health problems, days of mental health problems, and crime and delinquency. Over a 12-month period, they found that the savings from implementing JDCs with Reclaiming Futures are more than double its costs, with a net savings of an average of $84,569 per youth. The majority of these cost savings are in the area of delinquency and crime. This is promising in that positive changes among youth also translate into cost savings. This very brief snapshot of Reclaiming Futures research and evaluation shows that Reclaiming Futures and the blended JDC-RF approach and model is promising for improving perceptions of systems, improving youth outcomes as they relate to substance use and delinquency and crime, and save money. Kagan and colleague and Tyson discuss these issues further in 2 policy commentaries in the special issue of Drug Court Review. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Evan, who will share some of Reclaiming Futures' new direction. Next slide.
Thank you, Bridget. Just want to highlight also the cost savings were impressive to us and also have led to lots of discussions about strategies for reinvesting local savings or county and state savings in strategies like Reclaiming Futures and other community-based approaches, and we're very excited about that. Just a couple of things that we have in development and that we're looking forward to putting on the ground and piloting out in the field. We have worked with the W. Haywood Burns Institute and a group called Impact Justice in Oakland to develop a new framework focused on racial and ethnic disparities in the key decision points that we make around behavioral health within juvenile justice. And we look forward to talking more about that in a future webinar and to piloting that approach nationally. We have developed a new adaptation of something you may have heard about. It's sort of all over the place and in the press and used across the country. Screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment, otherwise known as SBIRT. Reclaiming Futures has developed and is now pilot testing in 9 sites around the country. Includes a controlled 5-state pilot of our version of SBIRT, focused on diversion points in juvenile justice, where decisions about health collide with decisions about juvenile justice diversion, and that pilot is underway now. We hope to have preliminary results soon. And we've also begun working on an adaptation of our overall approach that you heard about today for school settings, which integrates an understanding of the role that school discipline and school discipline reform plays along with public health, in a way of pulling those things together as we've done in juvenile justice. Next slide, please. Here are some references. As you all have heard, you will get copies of this PowerPoint at the conclusion of the webinar, but just to show you that here are the references for Bridget's portion of the presentation. And that's all I have. I'll bounce it back to our moderator. I want to thank everybody for joining us.
Great, and thank you, Evan. Amy, if we could just move along to the question and answer section. Wonderful. We do have actually a question from the audience, just came in. Can you please clarify the primary difference between the general JDCs and those who have incorporated the Reclaiming Futures model?
Sure, I'll jump in and tackle that one. Well, juvenile drug courts have been around for, I don't know the full history, but think they began about 10 or 15 years ago and have increased in their prevalence around the country over the last 15 years to the point where there are about 700 of them. It's a generic approach that's driven by a set of principles known as the 16 strategies developed and disseminated by the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And in those principles, in the 16 strategies, you'll hear a lot of what we talked about today, like the importance of family, the importance of using evidence-based practices, etc. But I use the term generic because the approach is not prescriptive necessarily of how you actually do that. How do you make this happen on the ground? And so a juvenile drug court that works with Reclaiming Futures is intentional about all of those elements. Selecting culturally and locally appropriate evidence-based practices, forging a local governance structure to help plan and implement, and giving practical legs to what is meant by family engagement and positive youth development. It's sort of a framework and a catalyst to help a juvenile drug court achieve what it aspires to based on the principles. So there are far more juvenile drug courts out there that do not use Reclaiming Futures as the implementation framework. We would like to see more. And the results of the study that Bridget talked about are the results of the impact of superimposing those two approaches on each other.
Great, thanks, Evan. And I'm also being mindful of our time. We're going to end at 11, but we would be willing to stay on for a few more minutes if folks have any more questions for our panelists. And I don't know if any of our panelists would like to give some closing thoughts. Maybe Hernan, if you want to reflect on everything that we've talked about today.
Yeah. Once again, everyone who's still, thank you for being a part of this webinar. And again, I think all of the different principles and sort of frameworks that were just discussed are definitely very good examples of things that at some point or another I individually as a young person back in the day, which I'm still a young adult, but not a young person as much as before, would actually sort of really put my stamp on and really say that if we are to work in collaboration across systems and thinking about how young adults and young people in general are being given services that are positive, youth-focused, and that are really thinking about their developmental needs, then we should always keep in mind the fact that there are these ever-changing dynamics both in systems and in the community that are always going to be impacting a young person's way of thinking and development throughout the course of their life. And so also realizing that as we're thinking through this, we're thinking about how young people who are transitioning out of systems are going to be transitioning to adult systems and adult care and adult mental health supportive systems. And so always keeping in mind that there is always going to be this transition phase for youth and how they're going to go into adult settings in the future and how they actually go for those services or request some of those services in the future. It's also something that we need to keep in mind in terms of how each framework is keeping that in mind. So thank you everyone for being a part of this and for allowing all of us to share our expertise and or lived experiences with you guys.
And thank you, Hernan. We actually did get another couple of questions. I think we can probably stay on to answer just one more. Let's see. So I think this is going to go back to the Reclaiming Futures folks. What are the sanctions for noncompliance that were referenced?
Well, I think I want to address the term noncompliance. I think this goes back to my point about kind of the collision course that juvenile justice and the courts are on with public health. I can think of no other health condition that young people might face, like asthma, diabetes, etc., where a failure to achieve positive engagement with treatment or to remember your asthma puffer might lead to punishment by a judge or by a prosecutor or a sanction. So it's really, in some ways, part of our position is that it's sort of odd for us to focus so heavily on issues of compliance, and rather we like to think more in terms of engagement, and that engagement is really a two-way street, and in fact the playing field on engagement is not level. That, as was mentioned earlier, most treatment programs are less than culturally responsive, less than trauma responsive, and so it's incumbent on treatment professionals and court professionals to really take the onus on themselves to create an engaging and positive experience in treatment. We don't advocate for particular sanctions. I think as we all know about adolescent development, structure is good, incentives are good, and balancing, the real world is that a lot of the kids we're talking about are in hot water, and so not to downplay that, but to balance if there is to be any kind of sanction, that it's counterbalanced much more heavily with what is developmentally appropriate, which is incentives and what is driven internally by the motivation of a young person to strive toward positive adulthood. And so that's my response to that. We don't really promote particular sanctions.
And Evan, if I might just offer one other comment on that. This is language a little bit from the 16 strategies, which is for juvenile drug courts, which is graduated responses for compliance and achievement of goals. So, and each, as I understand it, most juvenile drug courts have a set of sanctions that they may use if necessary.
That's a great clarification. Thank you, Bridget.
Okay, and thank you very much. And I'm just being very mindful of our time today. I know that, and I'm looking at our attendance list, we're dropping off quite a lot. I'm sure folks have a lot to do today, but we're glad and grateful for the time that you were able to share with us. I just wanted to let you know that we do have a few unanswered questions, and we will follow up via email as soon as it's practical. And I just wanted to thank, again, our panel for the time and effort you put into preparing this presentation. And I wanted to remind our audience that the webinar slides will be published shortly with a collection of our past webinars at the link that you now see on your screen. So thank you very much for attending, everyone. And with that, I'd like to say good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Goodbye now.